Someone was in my room. As I sat inside my room listening to one of my favorite bands, Motorhead, I suddenly heard a loud banging on my door. It was my mother, and she was not pleased. "Kenneth," she shouted, "I swear to God, if you don't turn the voice down in a count of 3, I'm confiscating your CDs. Despite the loud music, I could hear every word she said. I reluctantly turned off my music and shouted back, "But it's Halloween, Mom." My mother's voice grew even louder as she responded, "Halloween doesn't allow you to make others' ears bleed. Can't you ever listen to some classic music instead of those weird noises?" I rolled my eyes, knowing that we would never agree on music. My taste leaned towards the edgier side, while my mother preferred the classics. "And come downstairs to eat, Mrs. Flinch is here," she said, and quickly retreated down the hall, leaving me alone to my thoughts. I muttered under my breath. I thought this time would be different. I couldn't help but wonder if Mrs. Flinch was a distant relative of ours. She always seemed to be present at every special occasion, including Halloween. As I made my way out of my room, I sighed, knowing that Mrs. Flinch would be staying for dinner. Mrs. Flinch lived on the same block as us when I was around 5 years old, but then we moved. Well, not out of her life, since, as I mentioned, she was always here. As I walked downstairs, I was met with Mrs. Flinch's similar beaming smile as she greeted me. She was dressed up as a witch, and in my mind I couldn't help but think, I bet you are one. Mom and Mrs. Flinch talked about this and that while they put the food on the table. I could hear Dad watching something in the living room, probably avoiding this as always since he also didn't like Mrs. Flinch. I sat in one of the chairs at the dining table and listened to their weird conversation, but was only half attentive to what they were saying, until Mrs. Flinch said something that perked my ears. "You remember how Kenneth used to complain that someone was in his room?" I looked up and noticed Mom's expression changing into a horrified one as she heard her mention that. I was confused about what she was talking about, since I had no recollection of ever complaining of such a thing, but there was definitely something judging from Mom's expression. What of it? Her voice fumbled as she asked that, trying to keep herself focused on the turkey that she took out of the oven. "Well, there's a family that's moved into that house you guys used to live in, and they have a 4-year-old daughter. She is complaining the same thing Kenneth used to." Mom's hand trembled, and she quickly placed the turkey on the table as she heard Mrs. Flinch say that. I couldn't help but feel creeped out by the whole thing, and wondered what was really going on. I glanced around the room, observing the expressions on everyone's faces. It was clear that they were deep in thought, trying to process the implications of what Mrs. Flinch had just revealed. The silence was deafening, and it was as if we were all holding our breath, waiting for someone to break it. But no one said a word about what had just been mentioned, leaving the many questions building up in my mind unanswered. The moment Mrs. Flinch left, I couldn't contain my curiosity and asked, "What was it about, Mom?" She gazed up at me with a troubled expression, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't tell me. However, she took a huge sigh and asked, "You don't remember?" I nodded my head in response. Then she began recounting a strange tale. She told me that around the time I was 5, weird things started to happen in our house. There were footsteps that could be heard around my room. Initially, she thought it was me who had a habit of wearing Dad's footwear and walking around the house. But then one day, when Dad was at work and I was fast asleep, she heard the footsteps again, which left her horrified. Then one day, she heard me crying in my room, and as she walked into my room, she found me fallen on the floor, my head bleeding, and I was screaming at the top of my lungs. After administering first aid to me, she asked me what had happened, and I replied, "There was someone in my room." She felt a shiver down her spine at my words. She revealed that the final thing to happen before we decided to move out of that house was when she was listening to a record one day, and it started to slow down inexplicably. It was almost as if someone was holding a finger gently on the platter, till it finally stopped. My mom said she snapped, and out of the feeling of horror she was experiencing, she got up, tears building up in her eyes, and she shouted at the top of her lungs, "Will you leave us alone and go away forever?" She swore that as she said those words, the record went straight back to playing normal again. But the eeriness of the incident did not end there. Before we could experience anything like that again, we moved out of that house to the one we are currently living in. Although I was always skeptical of such stories, I knew my mom was not the kind of person who would make something like this up. But what was even stranger was how I didn't have any recollection of this incident, and only found out about it because someone else was experiencing the same thing. The thought still haunts me to this day. I wonder to this day who or what was lurking in that old house that we used to live in. Was it just a coincidence that both the new family's daughter and I were experiencing the same thing, or was something more sinister at play?
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. When I was 13, my mom and dad let me go trick-or-treating for the first time without any supervision. All these years later, I can still remember how psyched I was that I was allowed out in my own for the first time. But little did I know, it would prove to be my first and last time trick-or-treating on my own. So at around 5:30, me and a few of my middle school buddies all got together and started walking from house to house. But we were faced with something of a problem. Some of the fancier houses, the ones with spookier decor, were so jammed up with kids that some had literal lines forming down the driveways. So not wanting to wait in line for our candy, we figured we'd be smart and knock on the houses that no one else was knocking at. This was not a smart idea for obvious reasons, as the house with no decorations sometimes just tell you to get lost or pretend not to be home at all. Anyway, we knock on this one house. Instead of getting some grouchy grown-ups, some kid the same age as us answers the door. We didn't recognize him from school or from hanging around the neighborhood, so we're kind of confused, like, trick or treat? All before the kid just slams the door in our face. Feeling suitably rejected, a few of us go to just walk back down the driveway, but one of my friends is like, "Nah, screw this kid," and knocks on the door again. The kid answers, and my buddy sings, "Trick or treat," before striking this dumb pose as if to be like, "Screw you." The kid then absolutely explodes and screams like, "You knock on the house again and I'll kill you," before slamming the door again. Again, most of us are like, "Dude, just let it go." But this one friend of mine is basically like, "Oh, it's on." Shoves his finger into the house's doorbell and keeps it there, resulting in this long, solid burr sound. Even over the buzzer, you could hear the kid running back toward the door from the other side. Only this time, when he opens it up, he has this huge, gnarly-looking blade in his hand, like a sacrificial dagger in design, but at least the length of his forearm. As soon as we see it, we just bolt up the driveway and out into the street. But I kid you not, this kid follows us. We managed to maintain a steady distance between us as we ran, and the kid wasn't all that fast of a runner. But in all of our dumb costumes, we could run as fast as normal, so we're in serious danger of maybe tripping, falling, or just slowing down enough for this psycho knife kid to catch up to us. I think the worst part was when we saw some lady taking out the trash and we ran to her for help. She just looked at us like we were playing a prank, and then when she saw the knife, she just bolts back indoors too. I swear to God, that was the worst feeling, thinking, my God, no one's gonna help us. I remember seeing the fastest of us, like swerving over to some house on one side of the street while we were running down. Only when I got a little closer did I realize he was bolting into an open garage. We all follow, and we managed to pull the manual door down just in time to shut out the knife kid, who then starts kicking the garage door. This summons the homeowner into the garage, who's obviously like, "What are you doing here?" But once we explain the situation, the guy runs off to call the cops. We're still in the garage, shaking and panting, still terrified the kid is going to break into the guy's home somehow. But the next time the homeowner appeared in the garage, he had his cell phone in one hand and a gun in the other. Only then did I actually start to feel safe. Like, I'm not even a gun guy or anything like that, but I saw that thing as just, okay, the kid gets in, he's done. And in the moment, that actually calmed me down. Kinda scary that it did, but we move on. Anyways, the cops showed up pretty quick, which meant we had the pleasure of watching that stupid psycho get slammed into the pavement. Kind of a sad story in a way, because we heard the kid was super neglected by his parents and that he had a bunch of mental problems too. His parents used to leave him alone for weeks at a time because they traveled a bunch of work. Kind of like if Kevin from Home Alone had just suddenly lost his mind or something. I feel for the kid in a way, but honestly, he was lucky he didn't get shot, either by the homeowner or by the cops. We all hate that kid to this day because after that, we weren't allowed to go trick-or-treating until we were way too old for it anyway.
I used to do a lot of babysitting work in my teenage years, and one Halloween I got an offer good enough that I legitimately canceled my party plans. Not my party, obviously, and I won't brag by telling you how much I got, but the family's first choice canceled last minute and they were desperate. Anyway, the job is a dream one, the kid is adorable, and there's minimal trouble at bedtime. Then after the kid fell asleep, I'm left to kill some time in the usual way, watching TV, texting, ordering pizza, etc. Anyway, since it was Halloween, I'm watching a few spooky movies and shows on TV. Shout out to the Treehouse of Horror marathon on Fox. Then all of a sudden, I start hearing something talking in another room. Now bear in mind that I think I'm home alone there, so hearing another voice while knowing the kid was asleep. Jesus Christ, I remember how my heart raced all those years later. It wasn't even just normal talking or whispering either, but this low, almost demonic voice speaking to another one. Ugh. It put the fear of God directly into me, I swear. I just jumped in, ran to the kitchen to grab the cordless phone and a knife, and then started edging towards the room I heard the voices coming from. The whole time I'm like, I need to protect this kid. But the fear of knowing I was going to be the first one to get got was honestly one of the worst things I've ever felt. Then right as I hear, 911, what's your emergency? And I know the dispatcher will hear whatever has happened. I burst in the room with the intruders, brandishing the knife and shouting, I got the cops on the phone. Furbies. It was Furbies talking to each other in the middle of the night, in the dark. I had to explain to the dispatcher that there had been a horrible mistake and that I was so sorry. I honestly thought that they'd be mad that I called for a false alarm, but the nice lady explained it's better to be safe than sorry, and then hung up. Definitely the single scariest thing that's ever happened to me on a babysitting job, and yes, I am embarrassed. But I'll never forget that feeling of vulnerability and still knowing I had a responsibility to protect someone. Anyway, it all worked out in the end because I admitted the whole thing to the kids' parents when they arrived home, just in case the cops called by to warn them about the calling. They didn't, obviously, and I was just paranoid they would and that I might end up losing any future work from these two. Luckily, they were actually kind of impressed that I'd protected their daughter like that, and only ever called me in the future when they needed someone to babysit. So, all's well that ends well, I guess.
In the summer of 2006, I was offered a place to study history at Bangor University in North Wales. It wasn't my first choice of uni, but I always wanted to move away for university. I mean, That's half the point of the whole thing, isn't it? See, new places meet new people, expand and enrich your intellect and all that. Bangor wasn't exactly Manchester or Birmingham, but there was something very quaint about having such a relatively prestigious university built into such a small and storied town. In the end, I only lived in Bangor for the better part of a year, as I ended up dropping out due to family problems. But my brief time there yielded a variety of different experiences. Some I'll always remember, and some I wish I could forget. So much like most other students at that age, university bred a desire for, well, experimentation. And as I partook in a few puffs of the wise man's mint, as one of my mates called it, and decided that, yeah, it was something I was going to get into, I didn't take the drinking all that much, too much puking, and the hangovers just weren't worth it. But smoking up in a circle packed with intelligent, thoughtful people, that was a different kettle of fish entirely. Alright, most of the stuff we talked about was just absolute nonsense, which prompted nothing but a descent into giggles. But it was fun. And on top of that, you weren't a soulless, dehydrated husk the next morning. So one morning, I get talking to this local lad called Ricky. Ricky had grown up in Bangor, but wasn't academic enough for university. However, that didn't stop him from walking up into the student areas to take advantage of the public price pubs, which is how I got to talking to him. Eventually, the conversation got on to smoke and where I could get my hands on some, but local dealers didn't always trust the students, and even when they did, the chances that they just rip you off, assuming you were spending mommy and daddy's money, was very high indeed, which is why Ricky's promise of "I'll get some for you" was like music to my ears. I took his number down, told him I'd give him the text sometime, then finished up my pint, lost my game of pool, then wandered back to Hall's. The next day, I gave Ricky a text, and we arranged to meet outside a block of flats on the other side of town. This seemed a bit risky, as it was in the lower portion of Bangor, where the locals lived, and not up on the hill where most of the lecture rooms and halls were. But Ricky seemed like a nice enough bloke. I considered myself fairly streetwise, and with me having no other connections, I figured, why not? So I went to meet him, gave him my last 20 quid, and stood outside the flats and we went out to ring one of the buzzers. Now, I'm not completely soft, so I actually ended up peering over my shoulder to get a peek of which one he's ringing, just in case anything goes awry. The door opens. He says, "Back in a minute," and walks inside. A minute goes by, no sign of Ricky. 2 minutes go by, still no sign of Ricky. After 15 minutes of standing outside those flats like an absolute plant pot, I tried calling him, but as you can probably guess, he didn't answer his phone. I dropped him a few texts like "WTF is going on in here?" And again, I get no replies. Obviously, I'm absolutely furious, thinking, I can't believe I'm actually getting mugged off here, and there's absolutely no effing chance that I'm about to just walk away without kicking off. So I marched up to the little keypad near the front door of the flats and started buzzing the same button Ricky pushed. "Hello?" Some voice buzzes over the intercom. "Yeah, I'm a mate of Ricky's. He's got something that's mine. He needs to get back." Oh, the fellow on the other end was obviously playing dumb. "Look, mate, I've just seen him go into your flat, so you can either let me in or I'll come back later with my cousins and we can see what happens." It was a pure bluff. My cousins were like 60 miles away, but it worked. There was a brief silence, and then the door buzzed open. I walked right up the stairs to flat 3. knock on the door, and someone instantly answers it aloud about my age, who's keeping the door closed over because Ricky is evidently hiding inside. Mate, I know Ricky is here, and he's got something in mind. So he was here, yeah, the lad cuts me off, but he's just gone off the back, said he'll be back in a few minutes. Then I hear a voice that obviously belongs to someone older, saying, let him wait inside if he wants. The lad looks off to the right, then opens up the door. I walk in to see about 3 or 4 guys, again about my age, and one older balding bloke are down to his shoulders with this big, thick stash. In front of him on this dirty wooden coffee table, almost every kind of illegal substance you can imagine. And after waiting there for about 15 minutes, tension rising the whole time, I decided to give them something of an ultimatum. Because there is absolutely no doubt that I am getting scammed, and they just so happened to be in on it. Now, I know, what I did next was just stupid. But please don't underestimate how angry I was, and how I just refused to swallow my pride and walk away. So we turn to the old bloke and say something like, look man, let's just work this out. Ricky got 20 quid of mine, and I'm not stupid. I know what the crack is. I'm also not walking away without it. So let's just say you give me 1/8 of that green there, and that way, I don't have to file a police report saying some lad robbed me and ran into this flat. You get me? Big mistake. Massive mistake. Sometimes, it really is just better to swallow your pride and walk away, especially if the only other option is throwing around threats that you're unlikely to back up. But in the heat of the moment, that's kind of what I did. And by kind of, Mo, you'll see what I mean in a minute. Until hearing my police threat, the older bloke just sort of nods his up to say fair shout and gets up and walks over to the front door. I'm thinking, hang on, what's he doing? And when he locks the front door to the flat with a mortised lock and slides the key into his pocket, I just think, oh, you can imagine what came next. The 3 younger lads jumped me. I tried my best to fight back, but as you can probably guess, 3-on-1 didn't give me a chance to throw so much as 2 or 3 solid punches. Before I was on the deck getting the absolute life kicked out of me, all to a soundtrack of you coming to my flat and threatening me. Not happening. But the worst part was when I just heard, grab his hand, kept them still. I'm still in the middle of struggling, but I managed to get just a glimpse of the old bloke with a dumbbell in his hand might know what's coming. This fellow is going to smash my hand the bits without weight, and I'm probably never going to be able to write or type properly again. Thankfully, he didn't go through a smash in my hand up. Instead, he does this faint thing right as I think he's going to do it, then laughs his head off when I let out this embarrassingly girly scream. After that, I'm quite literally thrown out of the flat, and as I manage to bring myself to my feet and look back to see that one of the lads has my bloody provisional driver's license in hand, the wallet must have fallen out of the swipe during the kicking. Ah well, now we know your name and where you live. Go the filth and you're a dead man. Get lost. I wandered. But the story doesn't end there. It just gets much weirder and arguably more terrifying. If I'd have just walked away with a bit of a bruised ego, I'd have saved myself a good kicking. However, in actually laying hands on me, these lads had made a huge mistake. I wasn't some gangster bound to a code of silence and honesty. Neither were they. I was a big city, and I definitely wasn't scared of some small town dealers. And if they thought they could just intimidate some kid into silence, that were dead wrong. Because the first place I go, after I ended up getting kicked out of the Phyllis flat, is the Bangor police station. I was just dead honest with them. I told them I got scammed trying to buy smoke. Told the man being battered with me thinking the whole time, they're going to go round up this bloke's flat, and they're going to know he's got drugs in there. The place stunk of them, and that's how I'm going to get my own back. Solid plan, right? And quick side note, for anyone who says I'm a coward, a grass, or a snitch for going to the police, wind your neck in Tony, Montana. This isn't The Wire. This is real life, and you fight with anything you've got available to you. Only, it didn't quite turn out like that. I was hoping the police would knock round Nick the Bloke and his underlings, and then I'd see massive drug busts in the papers for a week or something like that. But when the police got back in touch, they said they'd nick a lad for assaulting me, but he was going to plead guilty, so it didn't look like I'd have to go to court or anything. They gave me some leaflets on getting over trauma, advised me to file victims of crime compensation claim, and then that was that. Yeah, it was some small measure of revenge, but it wasn't quite the complete and utter takedown I'd been hoping for. That being said, it would turn out that I didn't have to lift a finger to get my own back on Ricky. His own people would do that for me. Not even 7 days later, I'm doing a bit of food shopping down at Morson's, when who should I see? The giant cast on his leg and bruises all over his face. But Ricky, of all people, almost everyone I spoke to about it was like, wow, that's some karma in action right there. And they might still be right. It might have been a complete coincidence that 1 week the lad robs me, and the next he's in a bloody thigh cast, which, how I know it, must have been a really bad break. Stranger things have happened, right? But there's a thing. I don't really believe in coincidences. I believe in cause and effect. I think the top dog down in the lower town flat was just that top dog in the area. And I think the trouble Ricky ended up causing him Monday was only a fanny hair away from being nicked for selling Class A's. I think he was so angry that he had his little minions break Ricky's leg. I mean, how else to explain his black eyes and all that? He slipped and fell on the path of an oncoming fun run, pulled the other one. But then, the thing that really tickled me, the thing that honestly made my blood run cold, was this. If they were willing to do that to one of their own, they wouldn't bat an eyelid at the idea of doing the same to some other idiot student, would they? And it's only then that I realized how bloody lucky I'd really been. A few months after I completely balls up my end-of-year exams, ended up dropping out, and that was the end of that chapter. Needless to say, despite the relatively short amount of time I'd spent there, Bangor really did teach me a thing or two. They just turned out not quite to be the kind of things I imagined when I arrived.